3 weeks ago, the man who called Donald Trump a supreme bandit, the same man who told Nigeria to cut every military tie with America, sat down for a television interview and quietly dropped a bombshell. He said, calmly, almost casually, that the Nigerian federal government knows every terrorist in this country by name and by location. Now hold that thought, because 2 months before that interview, after Trump's forces pulled Nicolás Maduro out of his own palace in Caracas in the middle of the night, the internet exploded with reports that this same Sheikh Ahmad Gumi had gone completely silent, that he had deleted his anti-Trump posts, that the loudest Islamic voice against American military presence in Nigeria had suddenly disappeared from the conversation. So here is the question nobody is asking properly. What scared him first, and what emboldened him now? Because those are two different answers, and together they tell you everything about power, fear, and where Nigeria is actually headed in 2026. Stay with me. Before we go further, if you're new here, Niger Update 24/7 exists for one reason: to give every Nigerian, wherever you are, whatever region you're from, the political analysis that mainstream media won't touch. Hit subscribe and stay with me. This gets deeper. Let us go back to Christmas night, December 25th, 2025. While most of Nigeria was asleep, U.S. warships positioned in the Gulf of Guinea fired over a dozen precision missiles into Sokoto state. The target, fighters linked to the Islamic State in West Africa. At least one strike landed close to a civilian settlement, Jabo village in Tambowal local government area, roughly 58 kilometers from Sokoto city. Residents described waking up to explosions, to shock waves moving through the ground. The Nigerian government confirmed it. Information Minister Mohammed Idris said 16 strikes were carried out with the full involvement of Nigerian armed forces and with, and I quote the official language here, explicit approval from President Bola Tinubu. Now here is something that almost nobody reported clearly. The Sultan of Sokoto, the supreme spiritual leader of Nigerian Muslims, Muhammadu Saad Abubakar III, said nothing. No statement, no condemnation, no support. Silence. Sheikh Gumi did not stay silent. He came out swinging. He called the airstrikes a neo-Crusade war against Islam. He said the strikes targeted a 90% Muslim region on Christmas Eve under the pretext of protecting Christians, and that, in his words, says a lot. He called Nigerians who welcomed the strikes stupid and misguided. He told the government to terminate all military cooperation with the United States immediately. Then, 9 days later, January 3, 2026, the world woke up to something even more dramatic. U.S. Special Forces had breached Nicolás Maduro's compound in Caracas, Venezuela. In a nighttime operation, they killed dozens of Venezuelan and Cuban guards, seized Maduro and his wife, and transported them to New York to face narco-terrorism charges. Trump called it one of the most stunning displays of American military power in history. Gumi responded. He called it supreme banditry. He said powerful nations abuse their might to kidnap leaders of weaker states. And then, according to what went viral across Nigerian social media, he went quiet. Posts allegedly disappeared. The anti-Trump fire appeared to dim. PR Nigeria ran a fact-check and found that the posts were still publicly accessible. Gumi had not technically deleted them. But here is what I need you to understand, and this is the first thing most analysis of this story gets wrong. Whether he deleted the posts is almost beside the point. The viral narrative, the story that Nigeria's loudest anti-American cleric went silent the moment Trump extracted a sitting president from his bedroom, that story is now doing real political work inside Nigeria. Millions of people believe it, and somebody benefits from that belief being widespread. That somebody is not necessarily who you think. Let us talk about institutions, because this story only makes sense if you understand who actually has authority here and where that authority runs out. President Tinubu gave explicit approval for a foreign military power to fire 16 missiles into Nigerian territory. Let that sit for a moment. Under Section 5 of the 1999 Constitution, the President commands Nigeria's armed forces. But there is no constitutional provision that has ever been publicly interpreted to mean a president can unilaterally authorize a foreign military to conduct strikes on Nigerian soil without legislative approval. The National Assembly, the Senate, the House of Representatives has held no hearings. No committee has demanded to see the intelligence that justified those missiles over Sokoto. No motion has been raised about a status of forces agreement, the legal document that would normally govern how a foreign military operates on your territory. That document, if it exists, has never been disclosed to the Nigerian public. That silence from the National Assembly is not administrative, it is political, and we will come back to it.
Now, Sheikh Gumi. People keep asking whether Gumi has real power. He has no government title, he holds no elected office, he commands no soldiers. But he has done something successive Nigerian governments found useful. He could walk into rooms that no general would admit entering. He could speak to armed bandit commanders in Zamfara and Katsina and Sokoto on behalf or adjacent to the Nigerian state, without the state being formally on record. That is extraordinary informal power, and it works precisely because it is unofficial. When that informal channel appears threatened, when a man like Gumi recalibrates his public voice, a vacuum opens. And in the Northwest, vacuums in informal authority do not stay empty. They fill with something worse. Now let us talk strategy, because this is where it gets genuinely complex. Tinubu's calculation with the Sokoto strikes was actually sophisticated. By partnering with Washington, he allowed a foreign power to strike terrorist targets that his own military had failed to neutralize for years, while framing it as a Nigerian-led operation. He absorbed the security credibility without the political cost of a domestic military overreach. Clean hands, visible results. But then, Gumi gave that television interview in March 2026, and suddenly, Tinubu has a problem. Because Gumi sat down and said, effectively, the government knows exactly who the terrorists are and where they are hiding. If that is true, and Gumi is in a position to know, then the logical question every Nigerian should be asking is, why did it take American missiles? Why did Nigerian soldiers not act on that knowledge? Who in the Nigerian system had an interest in that information not being acted upon? That is not a question about Gumi, that is a question about governance, and Tinubu's people know it. Here is what I need you to think about carefully. Gumi also said something remarkable in that same period. He acknowledged, publicly, that Trump would pursue terrorists anywhere in the world and destroy them. This is a man who had called America a bigger terrorist than Boko Haram weeks earlier. So what changed? Three possibilities. First, genuine recalibration. He saw what happened in Venezuela and concluded that the strategic environment had shifted. Second, electoral repositioning. He wants to appear more moderate and reasonable ahead of 2027 political alignments in the North. Third, and this is the most interesting reading, it was a warning to Abuja, not to Washington. He was saying in public, on television, America is watching. America acts. You in Aso Rock know the names. If you do not act, someone else will. A foreign affairs analyst, Dr. James Abaranji, put it directly. He said Gumi's revelation could, in his words, expedite American action in Nigeria because America already has its own intelligence picture of the security situation. That is pressure. That is a cleric who has felt the wind shift and is now repositioning himself not as a protector of armed groups, but as a whistleblower against a government that protects them. Now, if what I just told you surprises you, drop a comment below. I want to know what you think before we get to the part that changes everything. And Gumi said something else that should be circled on every political calendar in Abuja. He said this U.S. Nigeria security partnership is going to be a 2027 campaign discourse. He said it plainly. A man who understands northern electoral dynamics better than most political consultants in this country. Watch which northern governors and senators begin quietly distancing themselves from Tinubu's security posture in the coming months. That movement will tell you who is already running for 2027. What does any of this mean for ordinary Nigerians, north, south, east, or west?
Start with federal-state relations. Governor Aliyu Ahmed of Sokoto State was not publicly consulted before 16 missiles hit his state. The governor of Sokoto. The message to every state governor in Nigeria is unambiguous. Your territory is not fully yours when Abuja and Washington decide otherwise. But here is what I want southern Nigerians to hear clearly, because this conversation is often framed as a northern issue. If a legal and political framework now exists wherein the federal government can authorize foreign military strikes anywhere in Nigeria under a security justification without legislative oversight, that framework applies to every part of this country. The Niger Delta has oil, the Southeast has a separatist conflict, the Middle Belt has herder-farmer violence. Every region should be thinking about what this precedent means for their territory, not just Sokoto's. On the religious dimension, Gumi's neo-Crusade framing has not caught fire at a mass level yet, but it has planted a seed. Seeds do not need to grow immediately to matter. By 2027, with the right political watering, that framing could become an organizing principle in the north. At the same time, Christian communities in the Middle Belt and South, who have lived under Islamist violence for years, largely welcomed the strikes. Nigeria is now forming two different emotional narratives about American military intervention, based entirely on geography and lived experience. That is a fault line that political entrepreneurs will exploit. And then there is oil. Nigeria sits on some of the largest reserves in Africa. Venezuela held the world's largest proven reserves, and Trump has explicitly linked Venezuela operation to resource access and geopolitical compliance. Every Nigerian oil policymaker, every minister, every governor of an oil-producing state should be reading the Venezuela story as if it were written about them, because in Washington, it may already be.
At the United Nations Security Council, Venezuela's representative said something that should have led every Nigerian newspaper. He said, and I am paraphrasing carefully here, that what was at stake was not just Venezuelan sovereignty, but the credibility of international law itself, and the principle that no single state can position itself as judge and executor of the global order. The Venezuelan delegate also revealed that in 2025 alone, the United States carried out bombings in 7 countries: Iran, Iraq, Nigeria, Somalia, Syria, Yemen, and Venezuela, none of which were authorized by the UN Security Council. Nigeria was on that list. Nigeria. Let that register. For Nigerians in the diaspora, particularly those living in the United States, you are now navigating something genuinely new. The country you live in has militarily struck the country you came from. How Nigerian American communities engage with their elected representatives on this matters. Washington frames Nigeria through a specific lens, including Nigeria's long-standing designation as a country of particular concern for religious freedom. And that framing shapes what American lawmakers believe is justified. Diaspora Nigerians have more influence over that framing than most people realize. Use it. Now, let me do something this channel always does: examine the strongest arguments on the other side. Some will say, Gumi was never silenced. The fact check proves it. His posts are still up. That is true, and it is an important correction. But the fact check reached far fewer people than the viral claim. In Nigeria's information environment, the perception became the reality for millions. The political work was already done before PR Nigeria published a single word. Others will say the U.S. strikes were good for Nigeria. Nigerians broadly welcomed them, and the terrorists being hit have killed thousands of our people. Also true, the counter-terrorism rationale is legitimate and important, but welcoming a specific operation is not the same as endorsing an open-ended framework for foreign military action without legislative oversight. Those are different things, and conflating them is dangerous. And some will say, Gumi is just a cleric. He has no formal power. Why does his silence or speech matter? This misunderstands how northern Nigeria actually functions. Gumi's value was always his unofficial access, the rooms he could enter that the state could not officially enter.
If that access fractures, whether through fear, recalibration, or external pressure, the informal channels that have helped contain banditry in the Northwest begin to break down. The consequences are felt in Zamfara villages and Katsina farms, not in Abuja boardrooms. And here, I promised you earlier, is the institution I said we had not yet talked about, the most important one to watch: the Nigerian National Assembly. The Senate and House of Representatives have been, since Christmas Day, almost completely silent. No committee hearings on the legal basis for the Sokoto strikes, no demand to see the intelligence, no public debate on a status of forces agreement, nothing. If that silence continues into the 2027 campaign season, the silence itself is the scandal, because it means Nigeria's elected legislature has decided, either through complicity or cowardice, that the executive can authorize foreign military action on Nigerian soil with no democratic accountability whatsoever. Every Nigerian, regardless of religion, regardless of region, regardless of who you voted for, should find that unacceptable. We started with one question. Why did the man who called Trump a supreme bandit appear to go quiet the moment Trump pulled the sitting president out of his palace? Here is the measured answer. Gumi did not fully go quiet, but his register changed, his framing shifted, and now, in March 2026, he is talking again, but this time the finger is pointed not at Washington, but at Abuja. That shift is the real story. Because when an informal power broker who spent years mediating between the Nigerian state and armed groups starts publicly accusing that same state of protecting those groups, you are watching the informal architecture of northern Nigerian security begin to fracture. What fuels that fracture in the next 18 months before the 2027 elections will matter more than any single drone strike or social media deletion. The question is not whether Sheikh Gumi is brave or afraid. The question is whether Nigeria has the institutions, the legislature, the judiciary, the free press, to manage what comes next without surrendering its sovereignty to either a foreign military or an unaccountable cleric. Watch that space. If this analysis gave you clarity, share it with one Nigerian who needs to understand what is really happening. Like, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. Naija updates 24/7. We never stop watching.